Who started working in jQuery? Is everyone, most people, some people not? Okay, that's okay. So yeah, so if anyone who's started working in jQuery has noticed that you can do essentially the same things. And the interesting thing about jQuery is that it kind of did these things better first. So why do we use it, right? Like, why do we use jQuery if we can do all this stuff already using built-in JavaScript stuff that's included in the browser? Question is, why do we use it? If we go to the jQuery website, they kind of advertise it as this library that can allow you to write less code and do more. And I think that that's an interesting value proposition, right? Who wants to do the same amount and write less code? That, to me, that's always a good thing. Fewer bugs with less code usually. Okay, so we're going to see if that's true today. If we can write less and do more, we'll find out. Another reason why we want to use jQuery, or why it was so popular before and maybe is less of a benefit nowadays, is this compatibility aspect. And so back when we had Internet Explorer 6 and 8 and these sort of browsers that just they were mavericks. They went off on their own and did whatever they wanted to do. And so jQuery decided, or the team at jQuery decided to build this library that would commonize these things. You provide a single interface to the developer, and then the library will decide, based on which browser it's running in, how it's going to actually accomplish the goals of the developer. Right? So that's compatibility. It's about making things consistent across all these browsers. And again, today, not as big of a problem because browsers have, the vendors have sort of smartened up a little bit, right? Number three reason for us to teach you jQuery. It's popular. I mean, it is still relatively popular. Maybe not in terms of new project starts. Like maybe you're not seeing a ton of new projects being started with jQuery, but there's a lot of old projects that have been using jQuery for years that still exist that you might need to work on. So that's another reason why it's important to at least learn about this stuff. Right? There's a little bit of a history of it. So how old is it? 2006, August 26th. That's the initial release of this library. So I'd say it's pretty old. And then there's a big milestone there, and it took them almost 7 years to get to this second version. And that big milestone was when they dropped support for IE6 and IE8. When they built this library and they made it compatible across all these browsers, they had to add a whole bunch of extra code to make it work for IE6 and IE8. So this release version 2, one of the main benefits of this release is that they were able to take a whole bunch of that source code and just get rid of it, which means the overall bundle size for jQuery went down. And this was one of the things that I was concerned about early on with jQuery, is like, this thing is so big, all my users have to download this in order to see my site, even those users that are not running IE6 or IE8, that don't even run that code. Pretty big milestone for them, happened about 6 years ago. And then there's this other sort of version 3 release, and they're not really going to change. We're not going to see changes in jQuery anymore. So we'd expect it to sit in that 3.0 version, or 3.3.1 I think is what it is right now. I don't expect to see that change very much. They started to add some ES6 at that point, strict mode, etc. So this is the history of jQuery. Here's who's the Google Trends history of jQuery. Everyone know what Google Trends is? We can go search for a term, and it kind of tells us how interested other people were in that same term over a certain amount of time. So here's jQuery's interest over time. We'll just say that down there is 0, I guess. Up there is the peak of jQuery. But we can see that it over about 4 or so years, it gained quite a bit of popularity. I'd say that around 2010, 2011 is the middle of that graph, right? And we're seeing that it didn't just drop off. People didn't just stop searching for it. But we're seeing that people are less and less interested in this as a library. And I bet you if we looked at, for example, React, Angular, any of these more common modern frameworks or libraries these days, we'd probably see their popularity going up at this time, right? Okay, so we got this. So now we know why we're using jQuery. Yes, it's old, but we're still going to learn about it. There's some good benefits from it. Makes things a bit easier. Your midterm project, that's where you're going to use it. Is it a library or is it a framework? Does anybody know what the difference is between these two when we're talking about, you know, these npm packages, or, you know, wherever we're getting this code from? Difference between a library and a framework? Okay. So I looked it up, and the truth is, you ask any developer and they might have a different answer for this, right? They might consider something a library, consider something else a framework. Ask another developer, they might disagree. But that's okay, because we just need to maybe think about this in a different way. So I would say that a library is typically sort of has one major purpose. So for example, jQuery, the purpose is to manipulate the DOM, whereas a framework might have a number of different libraries combined to allow you to build a web application, right? So jQuery, I think it's a library, whereas something like Rails, which you'll be using in week 7, that's definitely a framework, and it has a heavy opinion on how you use it. It's not just, here's a library, go do what you want with it. Ruby on Rails, the framework, says, no, this is how you build applications, and you follow our convention. You stay consistent with how we decided to do these things, and so framework might come with a lot more opinion as well. Does this really matter? Library or framework? Just kind of keep that in mind, that there is a difference, and usually it's the size of these things and the amount of responsibility these things have. I consider React to be a library. It only handles DOM manipulation. It's just a view library. Express, I consider that to be a library as well, although I think they call themselves a framework, right? But they call oh, that's not what I was looking for. Express.js. I always got to put JS or RB or something after it, right? Otherwise I'm going to get, yeah. Fast, unopinionated, minimalist web framework for Node.js. So they say unopinionated minimalist. When I think unopinionated and minimalist, I think library instead of framework. So that's what I'm saying, is that anyone can call it anything they want. But when you're thinking about it, does this thing do one thing, or does it allow you to do a whole bunch of different things? And that's probably the distinction I'll make at this point. Cool? Okay, so now we know that this thing's a library, and we need to be able to retrieve that thing and use it in our project. There's going to be a few ways for us to get this library. We'll go over these 3 ways. So the first one, we'll call it a CDN, the Content Delivery Network. And if I go to the jQuery website here, and I go to download jQuery, which is really what my goal is, right? That's what I want, is I want to be able to use this file. I go here, and they give me a whole bunch of different options here. I scroll down, and they're saying you can access this through any of these CDNs that you want. Does anybody not know what a CDN is, or maybe what some of the benefits of a CDN is? I can go. Yeah, okay, cool. So, Content Delivery Network. Imagine if there's a few benefits here, right? So, one of the benefits is that if I use a CDN hosted by Microsoft in order to serve my the jQuery library that my users will end up, or that I will use in my application, then who pays for the bandwidth for that? To download jQuery, for all those thousands and millions of users to download the jQuery library. I don't pay for the bandwidth. Microsoft does. It's their server. They're the ones serving it. So that's actually kind of a benefit, is maybe you can offload some of the resource costs of serving these files to someone else, to some other entity. And see, Google does it, Microsoft does it, and I think jQuery, they say theirs is provided by this company called StackPath or something like that. But the idea is just that someone else is hosting it, and so you're not paying for the bandwidth. So that's kind of cool. Another benefit, what do we know about caching files in the browser? Has anybody heard of the browser cache? Clear your browser cache. That might solve your problem for you, right? Anyone talk to customer support, and they're like, oh yeah, you could just follow my instructions. And then you follow their instructions, and you're like, why didn't you just tell me to clear my cache, right? So clearing the cache, why does that work? Maybe there's this old stale file there that's still being used, and that file should have been replaced, but somehow the cache got stale. And when you clear the cache, what it does is it'll download that new file off the server and save it and cache it instead. One of the benefits to using a CDN, let's say that all of us have our own websites and we all use jQuery and we all link to the exact same jQuery library on that CDN. Because it's coming from the same place and it's the same file, same size, same everything, someone comes to my website, they download jQuery, and then they go to any of your websites, jQuery is already cached for them. That's kind of cool. So another reason why we might use something like Google Fonts is that if someone's already downloaded that font, then they're just going to get to your site quicker than they would have otherwise. So maybe a little bit better at caching this way. Whereas if we all decide to all send out jQuery ourselves from our own servers, then when they come to my server, they download jQuery. Then when they go to your server, they download jQuery. Then when they go to your server, they download jQuery. And so this user's downloaded jQuery way too many times, right? A CDN provides some of these benefits. And it's really easy to use. So let me show you what that looks like. I go into my index.html here. Oh, and I've already done it. I've just taken a link to that other host to the, with another path here to another resource, jQuery.js. And so this is how you use a CDN. Is you just find the link. I can take this thing and make a request for it. Just go into my browser. There it is, jQuery, the library, right? So CDNs, does that kind of make sense now? That's one of the options. That's what I recommend for you to use this week. It doesn't make much sense to use any other option. But I'm going to show you a second one anyways. The second option is that we just download the library and we serve it ourselves. Right? So instead of linking directly to someone else's server, we will link to the jQuery file that we will provide. And so what does that look like? I go to the jQuery website, click on download. I try and find the version I want to download. Do I want the compressed or uncompressed version? What is the difference between these things? Why do they offer me an option here? Has anyone seen minified JS before? If I click on this production version, production means this is the one I actually want my end user to download. This does not look like I can read this at all, right? That's minified JavaScript. And the reason why is we don't need to send white space and stuff like that. That's just a waste of bytes. So we take this JavaScript file and we put it through a tool, and the tool spits out on the other side a smaller version of basically of the code that will run the exact same way. Okay. So this is the development version. That makes a little bit more sense. This is actually not minified. This is just the source code as it is. So I would say if we're in development mode, we probably want the uncompressed version, this one right here. It would allow us to debug a bit easier if we needed to do something there. And then we could switch to the production version later if we want, the minified version later if we want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to download this file, and I can do it by either right-clicking and go Save Link As, or I can select all the text, copy it, go into my JS folder here, create a jQuery 3.3.1.js file, and just paste that in there. I've downloaded that code now, right? So if I've done that, I can head over here. I'll comment this out. Yeah, looks good. When I load up my site, I look at the network panel. It's downloading jQuery 3.3.1. And it is grabbing that from, maybe, how do I see that? Let's see. We can see that based on this path here, it's actually coming from the directory that my other JavaScript is. So I'm not using the CDN for this anymore, but I was able to actually serve this. We don't get any of those caching benefits, right? People only cache this now when they come to my site, and when they return to my site, it will use this cache version. But if they go to some other site that uses jQuery, they don't gain that benefit. So two ways, right? Third way, and I'm just going to show you this way. But down here in the notes, I say, just stay away from this for now. Oops. Yeah, just stay away from this for now. Starting in week 6, we will npm install all of our front-end dependencies. We'll npm install React and React DOM and all that stuff if we need to. And we'll use our files from the node modules directory if we need to. But right now, this seems to be a little bit too much work and not a lot of gain, right? If we're just trying to get this one jQuery library, it doesn't have a lot of dependencies. I'm not going to have to deal with any dependencies. In that case, I would stick with, this CDN system here. But if you wanted to, you can always npm install jQuery into a project you have. Node modules directory will get created. You would need to make that directory servable by your web server too, right? So maybe what you would do is actually just download and then drag the file out of there and put it into your JavaScript file so that it was in your public directory or whatever. I don't know. None of that makes sense to me, and that's why I've said stay away from it right now. And eventually we will move to this, and you're going to gain those benefits. But for today, things are simple enough that we can stick with just a CDN. Okay. So we got this $, and I said at the beginning jQuery is $, and that's true. These jQuery and $, will mean the same thing when you have the jQuery browser or jQuery library loaded up in your environment. When the jQuery library runs, remember this morning I mentioned that it'll parse this HTML, it'll end up on this script here. It's going to now go down, it's going to make the request for that script. It's going to download it, it's going to parse it, compile it, run it. At that point, it'll then continue down to the app here. What it's doing is actually adding a couple of variables into that window object, into that global object, so we can access them from anywhere that we want. So that's why we can say from anywhere, like here for example, dollars or jQuery. I didn't define that in the file, but because jQuery does it for me, right? That's the code that adds this to the global object. That's the code that creates the jQuery access for us. If I go over here, I can actually print out the window information, and we can see at the top of window is this $, so that's jQuery. And it takes in a selector and some context, so that's actually the expected signature of jQuery. If I scroll down, I can see there's also something called jQuery, and jQuery has that exact same, so they both point at the same thing. Well, that makes sense. We made jQuery equal $, equal jQuery, so that's how that's happening. These things are interchangeable. I recommend just using the $. It's nice to type. It's simple. It's ubiquitous. It's convention. And I said so. I don't know. Okay. So both of these get added to the window. And I've got this quick example here, although I'm pretty confident people feel pretty good about this whole window global scope thing and how that's working in the browser. Is there anyone who wants to? I can run this example here. And so what the example is, at the very beginning, outside of any function, I just declare a global variable. I say global variable equals true. And then I have a global function. It's just something that's defined at the top level. And then I have a local variable here. And I have access to the global variable. I have access to the local variable. But when I print this stuff out, only global variable and global function will exist here. Local variable won't exist here because it's protected. So if I take this code, we can just see that. I think we have true. Yep, here's true, so that's global variable. Here's the function. Here's undefined. That's the local variable. So I guess, yeah. Does that make sense? I don't know if this. Should I spend more time on this at all? No. Okay, good. Let's keep moving then. All right. There's this syntax, right? So I can say either $, or jQuery, and then I pass it something. I pass it a string. I can pass it a function. And that string can be in all sorts of different formats. We found that out already, right? That there are so many different types of or things that I can pass to this function. It kind of handles anything for me. So we have to learn a little bit about that. But the truth of no matter what I pass to this, or actually, I'm not sure if that's true for anything, but for the most part, when I pass something to this, it's always going to return to me a jQuery object. So a jQuery object is this sort of collection of the things that it found or that it made with a whole bunch of functions on it that I can call on there. So those functions include things like .text and .html and .value and .toggle class, .add class, .remove class. Those are all functions that exist on the jQuery object, and the jQuery object is returned to us when we make a call like this to jQuery. It's a collection of DOM elements with functions with some helpful methods on it. So if anyone asks you what is a jQuery object, I hope that this is a good answer for you in an interview. A collection of DOM elements with some helpful methods. Maybe on the prototype. Yeah, that's where they exist. So on the prototype. But we haven't learned about prototypes yet. So here I can do that. I can actually say console.dir $prototype. I can see all of the methods that are available to me, like so. We're going to find some in here that are definitely familiar. I know I've definitely seen some people using this one already. And I've seen, I think, I don't know, has anyone used toggle class yet? No? That one's kind of cool. Because I don't have to worry if the class is on there or not. I just call this and it'll toggle it back and forth for me. And it does the checking. Is the class on there already? It is. Yep. Let me remove it. Oh, it's not there? I'll add it. What else do we have here? Slide down, slide up. That looks like some animation stuff, right? So all these things are functions that exist in jQuery. I can see them by just looking at the prototype for the jQuery, this object here. And here's here's some common methods from the API. Show and hide, first, value, etc. One thing I'd like to call out for this, though, if I go to jQuery documentation and I look up the let's say val method. It looks to me like val can actually handle receiving different types of values, or no values at all, even no arguments at all. And so you're going to notice with jQuery that some of these functions sort of have two purposes. This function will let me either retrieve the value if I don't give it any parameters. So this means give me back the value of this element. Whereas here, when I pass it a value, that's going to set the value on that element. So this function is multi-purpose. It will set or get depending on if you pass it a value or not. The CSS, do I want to get the CSS or do I want to set the CSS? I can use the same function for both. It just depends what parameters I pass to it. So this is the API. With the jQuery API, we get to do sort of like 4 categories of DOM work. So the selection, we were doing that this morning with document.querySelector or document.getElement, etc. There's traversal. This is something we didn't really do this morning. We didn't traverse much. We just searched for things from the top level. But traversal is this idea where if I already know about an element that is inside the DOM somewhere, and I know that there's an element that is maybe a sibling of that, or a child, or a parent, or somewhere related to that, I can traverse through the DOM to get there and not have to do searches from the top down every time. So this can be a way to maybe improve performance a little bit, reduce the amount of execution that's going on. That if I just say, if I'm in an element, if I have a reference to an element and I say .parent, it'll give me its parent element. That could be very useful, rather than just having to search from that thing from the top down, from scratch again. The third thing we can do is manipulate DOM nodes using jQuery. So that's things like .css and .value and .text and .html. Those are changing attributes on these DOM nodes for us. Toggle class, I would say, is also manipulation. It's changing the list of classes that are applied to that specific element. The fourth thing we do with jQuery is we create new elements. Right? So we can select things, we can travel around based on where we know we are already. We can manipulate the attributes of elements, and we can create new elements. And they're all done, all those things are done starting with this jQuery function here. And because jQuery, every time you call this function, it returns a jQuery object, and that jQuery object has all those functions on it, you can call functions chained. So actually, you know what? I'm just going to show you this example when we actually write the code. Just keep in mind that jQuery heavily uses method chaining, which might be something that's new for you, but we'll talk about that. This is kind of an example, although it's only one method that's attached on. But here, this button, it returns a jQuery object. The jQuery object has a function on it called on, and we pass it a click string to represent that we want to listen for a click event. I'd say we're writing less, right? Add event listener on. That's provably fewer characters. I'd say we're writing less and doing the same, though, right? Like this is write less, do the same still. DOM content loaded, we have something for that as well. Except we're not saying document.on and then DOM content loaded. jQuery has this built-in, they have a shortcut, and this is what it looks like. And you can shorten this you don't need to grab that document and call ready on it. You can instead just pass this ready function directly here, and jQuery says, oh, you passed me a function? That must be the onReady function. I'll just call it when the DOM is loaded, right? So it's a shortcut to get to that point. I recommend doing it this way. You don't need to do the full document.ready thing. Just pass a function to jQuery. And ideally you have one of these, but it is possible you have a few of these, one in each of your files. It's kind of up to you. That's not, I don't think, what you do in that respect, if you have only one onReady function or if you have a couple of them, not really going to change the rest of your implementation. So let's just not worry too much about if that's good or bad or not. I think right now the project that we're working on is small enough that it's not going to, that the problems that come with scaling applications that normally maybe we solve by changing these things, you're not going to run into those, so I'm not too worried about talking about that right now. Okay. Right, so that's the end of this material. Now what we're going to do is head back over to this app, and it really is, I just took the same thing we had this morning, changed the background color, added a little bit to the header here, and then re-implemented the app.js file using jQuery instead. Right? So finish. Yeah. And so this is working. And I actually added another little feature to it because I thought, well, can I do more and with less or the same amount of code as I had before? And so I added this little feature here where any of these items, I can click on them to mark that they've been completed already. Right? All right. So I'm going to dump all of this, app.js. I'm going to reload, and now this thing doesn't work. Okay. All right. So what are my goals for this application? It's the same as this morning, right? What's the first thing that I want to do? Okay, so I'll type something and then list it. But let's break that down into a few more steps. So I'm going to type something in here. And now what would happen? What would the user do? I click the add button, right? So that seems to me like we need to attach an event to this add button because that's going to trigger, again, all of this behavior. So let's grab the button and say on click for this button, we will just console log clicked. Oh, Thank you. Yeah, so we're seeing here this isn't working, right? And if I try and actually we're going to see that that's the same problem we had this morning. Where it came and said, I don't have anything with that type. But if I were to run that code in here, it's no problem. It finds it, right? So this is the same problem as we had this morning. So we're going to wrap this whole thing in a function. And that can go in here now. So it's not going to try and select the button until after the DOM content is loaded. So this should actually work much better for us. And one of the added benefits here is that anything that I do within this function is now protected in a local scope. And so if I add more and more and more files to my project and I decide to use the same variables, there's a low chance that those things will conflict now. Whereas if I keep everything at the top level, everything goes into the global window object, eventually one of the two things might conflict. So it's not a bad thing to put everything into a function like this. It's actually a strategy a lot of people would use when building libraries to protect all their code from conflicts like that. So let's see if this works. Okay, looks like it's working. We just need that prevent default, right? So there we go. We can see. Now when I click the button, it outputs that it's been clicked. And I want to grab the input field, and I want to grab its value and console log that now. Oops. Right. So when I call val without a parameter, it's going to retrieve the value. And prints it out for me. So that's working. Okay. What's next? Let's go back to the browser. I typed in something. And I click the button. What do we want to happen now? We're going to put it into the HTML list. So the steps for that, if we just jump in and say, we're going to just create this add to do. I would say that when I click on the button, I want to add a to do. So I could just write a function now called add to do that takes in content. And when I click the button, I call that function with my let's just say content here. Or I'll just pass that in. Why not? No need for that variable right now. So here's add to do. When I add a to do, what are the actual discrete steps that I have to make? I am adding to the list for sure, right? But what are the steps I need to take to do that? Yeah. Well, so we say HTML file. I would say to use jQuery to be able to select items from the DOM. The HTML file becomes the DOM, and then we manipulate the DOM. The HTML file will stay the same way it was when we loaded it. It's the DOM that changes, right? And if we go in here and I go view source, right? We'll see here there's nothing in the UL. And if I well, I guess I should You know what, I'm going to come back and show that to you in a second because I need some elements in there added dynamically before I can show you the difference. Because there is this idea of like a runtime, here's the DOM, and then there's the view source, and that was just the original HTML that started the whole thing. But that view source never changes after that. It's just used to feed the DOM initially. So I want to select an element from the DOM, this list, and I want to append to it an item or a list item that I've created. So let's start by creating the list item. And now this is a slightly different syntax than what I had down here, right? The difference, what's the difference? What do I have to do now if I want to create an item. Yeah, no one? Yeah. Yeah, this is like the slight difference, is that I have to put the HTML tags around it. Now it knows I'm not trying to find an element, an LI, I'm trying to create one. That's the only difference here. And so jQuery is reading this text and then deciding what to do with it. And I don't have to now create that text node. I can just say, I can take the item, that list item that was created, and then set its text. And so that makes it a little bit easier on me, right? See what it looks like when we do this. It printed out this LI, and the LI has text content test. That's good. Has outer text test and all that. So that's working. I'm actually creating that element. Now what I want to do is select the UL. So I'm not going to use those braces anymore. I'm just going to select the UL, and I'm going to append my item to it. That was a lot easier than what we did. I think that was actually quite a bit simpler than what we did this morning, and a lot of it has to do with this method chaining that I was able to do, or the ability to do that. I can actually take this, pass it right in there. Oh, good question. So the question, when did we create the UL? It was in my initial index, so it was already there. Now that I have these things, I can show you what I wanted to before, which was if I right-click and I go View Page Source, this is the HTML I loaded, and it had an unordered list in it already. If it didn't, I would have to select the div, create the unordered list, and append it. Now, so if I add some items, I can see here that this is a representation of the DOM right now. This is actually at runtime the DOM. We add some items. And we see that this UL now has items in it. But when I go to view source, they're not there. They didn't get written back to this HTML. Right? All right. So we had a few other things that we wanted to do. Right? We wanted to, well, I think, not allow for this. So here we might say if, oops, if there is a value, add to do. Okay, so that fixes that problem. And we also wanted to clear this when we post it, right? Now I'm going to use this empty string here to set the value now to empty. So before I was retrieving it, now I'm going to set it to empty when I'm done with it. So that works. And that just shows that val is in fact a multi-purpose function. Okay. So I've got a little bit of a problem here. I want to call out something that we have to think about quite a bit in jQuery. How many times am I looking for that input that's on the page? One? I see 3 searches for input, right? And the thing that costs, I think, the most in jQuery, or a lot in jQuery, is doing these searches, is trying to find these elements that we want to manipulate. And so if there's no need to actually do this search 3 times, if it doesn't result in anything different, then what you really want to do is do the search once, create the reference to that DOM node, and then reuse that reference here. And so now it only does one search. It only looks through the DOM once, but it's able to do all 3 of those operations. If this was expensive, if this value lookup was expensive, then I might cache that into a variable as well and use it twice there, right? So just keep that in mind. The main thing with jQuery that you want to do in terms of optimization is just unnecessary searching through the DOM is what causes jQuery applications to be a bit slower, So keep that in mind. All right. It should still work the same. So one of the other cool things when they say write less, do more, I'm given more options. I feel really limited when I use the vanilla API. I feel like I always have to work in one direction. If I want to add something into the DOM, I have to find the thing that I want to add it to, and then I have to append child on that. Sometimes I want to go the other way. I have this thing and I want to append it to something else, right? So jQuery gives us both of these options. It's more flexible. I can accomplish the same goal by either starting with my LI here, create my LI, set the text on that LI, and then append to a UL. All right, so that's options. And sometimes it makes more sense to append to something because you already have the thing you want to append. And sometimes it makes sense to actually just do append rather than append to. But you get the option. I like that. I think that's actually a nice thing about jQuery is I feel a little bit more free to write the code in the direction that I want. Which one do we want to keep? Append to? Yeah, let's keep that one. Right. There we go. Okay. So I've satisfied all the same requirements from this morning, but I have one more requirement that I want to satisfy, and that is when I click on this, I want it to apply a style here that I've already created called, where is it? Done. Right? So when I add the class done to one of these list items, then it will have a line through it, and its opacity will be put down to 0.7 or 70% opacity. And I can show that to you here. If I head on over to this element, I can actually just class equals done. Right? So that's the effect that it has on this element. So I need to dynamically change that, right? So how would I actually what are the steps I need in order to make it so that when I have an item and I click on it, that it toggles the class between done and not done? Yeah. You need a click event on what? On list, yeah, okay. Yeah, list item, right? Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, so I need to give this thing an event listener. And when can I do that? When does it make sense to do that? When I build it. Okay, so let's do that. Let's say I don't know if this is going to work because yeah, I haven't done it before. So let's see. So li text on click. I'm just going to console log first the event target. Okay, so that seems to be working. And so that means that I can now take this thing and call toggle class done on it. It's pretty easy, right? So I mean, I could just leave it at that and I'd be done. But I'm going to show you another way that we can do the same kind of thing using something called event delegation, which is a feature that we're getting from jQuery. And the idea about event delegation is that I can put an event on the list, but have it listen on the items. So this list that I have already, I don't know how many items are going to be in there. I don't necessarily want to have to remove event handlers when I remove items from the list or whatever. I don't want to. But what I could do instead is just add one large event handler, or one event that's the same size to the UL, and have it care only about LI clicks. event delegation jQuery. So event delegation actually uses the same API that we used earlier to set up an event handler, except it has this optional selector here. And so we can actually, instead of attaching this to every single LI that gets created, we can go down to the bottom of our, let's say below our button here, and say, we'll find the UL on click. I'll leave it for a second. I'm just going to add it to the whole thing. All right. So now, test. When I click on this, I'm definitely getting li test. That's good. And I didn't even actually have to do event delegation here. What happens if I say this, though? Well, that's different, right? It was different using this than it was event.target. Right? When I use event.target, the thing I clicked on was the list item, and so that was the target in the event. But when I use this, because I think it's because the event was actually put on the UL that it thinks the context of this is that UL. And so I don't tend to use, let's say, this context when writing jQuery, because I prefer to use event.target. But there is a way to solve this problem. We can just say that I actually care about the LIs that are, we're going to delegate the responsibility. The event delegation is going to go to these list items. And so now when I click on this thing, even though I've used this, the context of this was set correctly because I used event delegation. Right? So now I can access either, and event.target still works. So up to you. Back and forth we go. Right. So that's event delegation, and there is a little bit of on that here. Allows us to attach a single event listener to a parent element, one that exists right now, that will fire for all descendants matching a selector. That's that li. When those whether those descendants exist now or in the future. That's the cool part. I'm not having to manage whether or not my LIs have events on them or not. I just have to make sure that that one list has them and they're delegating properly. We talked about that. Cool. And then I talked a little bit about this context in here and what we just went over. So how do you feel? Anyone want to, any questions? Want to go over anything a little bit more? We got about, 10 minutes, a few minutes. Yeah, sure. Yeah. So is this a requirement of the app, or is it something you want to do? Okay. So, what is it? How does it work? Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, yeah. So that's a good question. So there's like, let's see. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how they implement that. Let's go to Twitter.
Maybe the extra text, you can take it and put it into like an array and then take it to an HTML file and then CSS it. Like just the extra array, the extra text should be different objects or a different array than the rest, and then apply the class to it or something.
So I think I think that what we're trying to do is actually change the style of something, of only a section of something inside of there, right? So yeah, I think we might be able to do that. I think we can actually inspect. So how I would start is I would probably just try and look at what they've done, because I can go in here, run this code, and see that's what they've done here is they've got this little, they've separated this out as a different element, right? We can see, and chances are it's actually just on top of that. Let's see. Let's see a little bit more about this. This is a, how is it positioned? Not sure. So this display block. Yeah, it looks like, well, actually, it looks like they're doing, here. There's their secret. I don't think, they're not using an input field or a text area, which means that if they're using a div instead, which is what they're doing, then they can have elements inside that div that use spans to apply those styles. And that's kind of what's happening here, is that they've separated the text, what's highlighted here, versus what is okay, into regular text and then this thing with the EM tag, and they put it into a div. They're like, well, how do we change the content of divs? HTML5. So content editable true on an element like this is allowing us to actually type into this div. So that I think does hopefully that answers roughly your question. Yeah, is that you have to hack it up. Twitter's probably pretty good at that. Yeah, I mean, look what they've done to this, right? Look at all that stuff that's sitting on that element to make it feel like a text area. Right? Cool. Any other questions? Okay. Thanks, everyone. And I'll send out these notes and message me if you think of something later.